The faint click of the front door opening startled me as I stood at the kitchen counter, absently stirring a pot of soup that I already knew no one but Sophie and I would eat. James had called earlier to say he'd be working late again, his voice so flat, so routine, that it barely registered anymore. 9 years of marriage had a way of turning words into white noise. "Mom?" Sophie's voice, sweet and bright, drifted in from the living room. She was on the floor, surrounded by a fortress of Legos. "Can I have some juice?" "Of course, sweetie," I called back, wiping my hands on a dish towel. I moved through the familiar rhythm of our evening. Juice for Sophie, bowls set on the table, a quick mental tally of what needed to be done before bedtime. Every moment, every task, was a cog in the finely tuned machine I'd built to keep life running smoothly. But lately, I couldn't shake the feeling that the machine was running me. The doorbell rang just as I was pouring the juice. My chest tightened with that strange mix of irritation and curiosity that always came with the unexpected. We weren't expecting anyone, and James rarely brought work home. When I opened the door, James stood there, flanked by 3 men I didn't recognize. His tie was loosened, his expression lighter than I'd seen in weeks. "Clara," he said, stepping aside to let the others in. "I brought some friends from work. I figured we could use a little life in this house." Life. The word hung in the air, bitter and hollow. The men trailed in, their voices filling the silence I'd grown so accustomed to. I plastered on a polite smile, introducing myself as James rattled off their names. The last man in line lingered just a moment longer than the rest. His handshake was firm, his grin disarming. "Mike," he said, his voice low and smooth, the kind that seemed built for laughter. His eyes locked on mine, just a beat too long, and I felt something strange ripple through me. I couldn't name it then, but it was sharp and undeniable, a fleeting jolt that set my pulse skittering. I didn't have time to dwell on it. The men settled into the living room, beers in hand, the sound of their laughter spilling into every corner of the house. I busied myself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables I didn't need, wiping counters that were already clean. Anything to keep my hands moving, my mind occupied. But every time I glanced toward the living room, I found Mike's eyes on me, a quiet intensity in his gaze that sent heat creeping up my neck. When I finally carried a tray of snacks into the room, I hesitated at the threshold. James was mid-story, his voice animated in a way I hadn't heard in years. The men laughed, leaning back into the couch cushions, their camaraderie easy and unguarded. And then there was Mike, perched on the armchair closest to the door, his beard dangling from his fingers. As I set the tray down on the coffee table, he turned toward me, his grin softening into something that felt almost knowing. "Clara, isn't it?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "James mentioned you're into design. Is that what you do?" "Not professionally," I said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Just a hobby." "Sounds more like a passion," he replied, his gaze steady. "James is lucky to have someone with such an eye for detail." I laughed, the sound brittle in my ears. "I just like things in their place." "That's obvious," he said, gesturing around the room. "This place is spotless. You must have the patience of a saint." Before I could respond, James cut in, his voice light but with an edge I recognized. "Don't let her fool you, Mike. She makes it look effortless, but this house runs on coffee and to-do lists." The men laughed, but Mike's expression didn't change. He just nodded, his eyes flicking back to mine for the briefest moment before returning to his drink. As the evening wore on, I found myself drawn into the conversation despite myself. The stories James and his friends shared were predictable, polished from years of retelling. But Mike was different. His humor was dry, his insights sharp, and every now and then, he'd glance my way, as if checking to see if I was paying attention. I was. Too much, perhaps. By the time the guests began to leave, the air in the house felt heavier, as though something unspoken lingered in the spaces between us. Mike was the last to go, standing in the doorway as James thanked him for coming. "Great to see you again," Mike said, clapping James on the shoulder. Then his gaze slid to me, his grin soft but unmistakably deliberate. "And nice to meet you, Clara. Hopefully not the last time." My throat tightened, but I managed a polite smile. "Likewise." When the door finally closed behind him, I leaned against it, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. James was already heading toward the kitchen, his mind back on work, his attention elsewhere. "Fun night?" I asked, my voice light but strained. "Yeah," he said over his shoulder, his tone distracted. "Good to catch up with Mike." "It's been too long." I nodded, my mind replaying every glance, every word, every moment that had passed between me and the man who had somehow shaken the quiet rhythm of my life in the span of a single evening. That night, as I lay in bed beside James, staring at the darkened ceiling, the memory of Mike's lingering gaze played in my mind like a song I couldn't turn off. It wasn't just his words or his presence. It was the way he made me feel. Seen, heard, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I turned onto my side, listening to the steady rhythm of James's breathing, and for the first time, I wondered if the life I'd built so carefully wasn't just a cage disguised as a home. I was unloading groceries when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Balancing a bag of apples on one hip, I fumbled to answer it, expecting a delivery notification or one of Sophie's school reminders. The voice on the other end, deep and calm, made me pause mid-step. "Clara? It's Mike." For a moment, I couldn't speak. His name alone sent a ripple through me, unsteady and unfamiliar. I shifted the bag higher on my hip, my mind racing for context. "Mike," I finally managed. "From the other night?" "That's the one," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I hope this isn't too weird, but I found your number on that site you mentioned. Where you sold that chair." I had to get creative. I blinked, taken off guard. "Creative for what?" "To check in," he said simply. "You mentioned your dad, and, well, I've been through something similar. Thought maybe I could share a few things that helped me. Sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who's been there." The kindness in his words disarmed me. James had never approached my grief this way. Practical and logical, he dealt with emotions the way he dealt with spreadsheets, tidy and efficient. But Mike's tone felt different, like he wasn't afraid to sit in the mess of it with me. "That's thoughtful of you," I said softly. "I appreciate it." "Of course. No pressure," he added quickly. "Just figured I'd offer." The call ended after a few more minutes, but it stayed with me for hours. Later that evening, while James scrolled through emails and Sophie colored at the dining table, I found myself replaying the conversation. Mike's voice, the easy way he'd drawn me out, it was a reminder of something I hadn't realized I was missing. The next day, I texted him, thanking him again. His reply was swift, warm, and casual. That small exchange turned into a steady thread of messages over the following weeks. Nothing inappropriate. At least, not at first. We talked about grief, about life, about the little things that made the days bearable. His humor was quick, his perspective refreshing, and somewhere along the way, I started to look forward to hearing from him. Then James announced his upcoming business trip. 3 days away, the house to myself. The idea of inviting Mike over came to me as if it had always been there, waiting. I told myself it was innocent. Just dinner, a chance to thank him for his support. But a part of me knew it wasn't that simple. When the day arrived, I spent hours preparing. The house was spotless, the table set perfectly, every detail arranged with a precision that felt almost desperate. By the time the doorbell rang, my heart was racing. Mike stood on the porch, dressed casually in a button-down shirt and jeans. He held a bottle of wine in one hand, his smile easy and warm. "Thought this might go well with dinner," he said, stepping inside. "Thank you," I said, taking it from him. "You didn't have to." He shrugged, his gaze sweeping the room. "Nice place. Feels lived in." I laughed nervously, motioning for him to sit while I finished in the kitchen. The scent of garlic and herbs filled the air, the sound of his voice filling the space as he told me about a recent hiking trip. He spoke with an energy that felt infectious, his words painting vivid pictures of sunlit trails and open skies. Over dinner, the conversation shifted. He asked me about my design projects, about Sophie, about the parts of my life I'd stopped sharing with anyone else. His questions weren't just polite, they were intentional, as if he was piecing together a puzzle only he could see. At one point, he leaned back, his eyes on mine. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions?" The question hit me like a gust of wind, sharp and unexpected. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "More often lately." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's easy to get stuck in routines. Harder to break out of them. Do you think you've broken out? I asked, surprising myself with the directness of the question. I try to, he said, his gaze steady. Life's too short not to. The weight of his words settled between us, heavy and unspoken. I reached for my wine glass, trying to steady the swirl of emotions inside me. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and I knew the boundary I was walking was thinner than ever. When the meal ended, I stood to clear the dishes, but Mike stopped me, his hand brushing mine. Leave it, he said softly. It can wait. Something in his tone made me pause. He was watching me, his eyes searching, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The pull between us was undeniable, electric in its intensity. But then I stepped back, breaking the spell. I should get these done, I said, my voice too bright, too forced. Mike nodded, stepping away to give me space, but the air between us remained charged. As he left that night, his parting words lingered in the quiet house. You deserve to feel alive, Clara. Don't forget that. Long after he was gone, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wine-stained napkin he'd left behind. His words echoed in my mind, louder than the silence that followed, and for the first time, I wondered what it would take to truly feel alive again. The house felt unnervingly quiet after Mike left. It wasn't the absence of sound that unsettled me. It was the absence of him. His parting words, you deserve to feel alive, echoed in my mind like a mantra I didn't know I needed. Over the next few days, I moved through my routine with a disjointed sense of reality. Sophie's laughter, James's brief calls from his trip. They all felt like background noise to the questions swirling in my head. Was this all my life was meant to be? And if not, what was I willing to risk to change it? When James returned home, I expected the weight of his presence to anchor me, to restore the balance I thought I'd lost. Instead, I felt more adrift than ever. His kiss was quick, his words distracted, and the gap between us yawned wider. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a message from Mike lit up my phone. Can we talk? Simple. Direct. It wasn't unusual, we'd been texting here and there, but something about this message felt different. I hesitated, staring at the screen, before typing back. When? Now. If you're free. I found myself in the park near Sophie's school, the one with the tall oaks and the walking paths that crisscrossed through patches of sunlight. Mike was waiting on a bench, his posture relaxed, but his expression guarded. Thanks for coming, he said as I approached, standing to greet me. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure either, I admitted, sitting down beside him. The space between us felt charged, like a wire stretched taut. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he broke the silence. I think about you, Clara. More than I should. His words hit like a spark to dry wood. I turned to him, my breath catching. Mike, Don't worry, he interrupted, his tone soft but firm. I'm not here to make things harder for you. I just needed you to know. Something inside me cracked, a fissure in the carefully constructed facade I'd built around my life. You already have, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mike exhaled, a slow, steady breath. I know. And I'm sorry. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unresolved. Then he stood, looking down at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You deserve to be happy, Clara. Whatever that looks like for you. And then he was gone, walking away without looking back. I sat there, the world around me a blur, until a cool breeze stirred me from my thoughts. His words lingered, not as a promise, but as a challenge. Could I be happy? Did I even know how? That night, as James sat across from me at the dinner table, talking about a potential promotion, I felt an unfamiliar resolve settle over me. I wasn't sure what my next step would be, but I knew I couldn't keep living this half-life. For Sophie. For myself. As I tucked her into bed, her tiny arms wrapped around my neck, I realized something profound. Happiness wasn't a place or a person. It was a choice, one I'd been too afraid to make. Downstairs, I found James still working, his laptop glowing in the dim light of the living room. I stood there for a long moment, watching him, before finally speaking. James, I said, my voice steady but quiet. He looked up, surprised. What is it? I think we need to talk. His brow furrowed, but he closed the laptop, giving me his full attention. Okay. About what? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my decision, the enormity of the change it might bring. About us. About everything. For the first time in years, it felt like we were on the brink of something real. Something honest. And in that moment, I wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever came next, I would face it, because I finally understood that I deserved to live, not just exist.